So you might be wondering why we're back here at night. We are in pursuit of the truth. I need to know just how much power this thing can make. And I looked at all the logs thoroughly. We just got strapped down. The neighbors are leaving. We're gonna go ahead and do one pull, proper 30 PSI, and see if we can hit that magic 700. We found the limit of the turbo. You want a 700 horsepower turbo? This thing is no joke. Still very rich, 4,500 to 5,000 RPM, where it just absolutely demolishes. It climbed. I never even planned to go higher on the boost. It really is at 7,000 RPM where this thing makes it max power. You see the hair, you see the rotor, you see the crazy look in my eyes, and you are on for one hell of a journey. This video is a very big summary with some quick deep dives into everything necessary and all the stuff that isn't necessary to make over 700 horsepower on a two rotor. That's over 350 horsepower per rotor at the wheels. The question really is, how are we doing it? What are we using? This is a 1988 Mazda RX-7. It's an FC block, just simply street ported and ported the exhaust. So all you're doing is taking the intake and the exhaust and just cleaning the edges up. That's really about it. Let's talk about the very star of this whole thing. Don't fuck with your rotors. Do not. Rotary shops absolutely suck ass. So the less you do to what Mazda created, the better. Do not scallop them. Do not make them lightweight. None of this stuff is actually helpful for you. All it's gonna do is take more of your time, more of your money, and when the engine inevitably blows, because all engines do, you have to replace that part. These rotors, as is, are amazing. I use stock side seals, stock corner seals, stock side seal springs. You get where I'm going with this. Apex seals, I've used a large variety of them. For the most part, doesn't matter which ones you pick. Stock are very fragile, they wear well, but they shatter and then they take out your motor. The next main thing is the housings. All I really care about is this right here. This is where the exhaust comes out. And this is also why these are better than Renesas motors, not side ports. So the exhaust comes out straight this way. All you're doing is cleaning up this shit. Match it to the sleeve on the inside. This steel sleeve is protecting the aluminum around it. Make it flow smooth. That's it. You can do that. Porting tool, little Dremel. The next thing, so these are intake ports. All you're doing is basically cleaning up what Mazda did. This you would want a template. Clean up, but intelligently. You can do that. The only thing that you particularly can't do that these engines absolutely need to make the power when you can make mistakes is doweling, studding, bolts. Elliot from Turbone, one of the things that sells out all the time from him is the bolt stud kit for the two-rotor RX-7. Get that. That makes the bolts as big as they can be without doing any machine work. Pineapple Racing sells solid dowels. It turns this from a hollow dowel into a solid one. Your oil system can no longer run through here, but bottom one can be solid, and away you go. Those don't require machine work as much as what I do, which is adding dowels. There's one spot that matters the most on this engine, right between the spark plugs. And under high load, this is the most critical. You want to get a dowel or a half-inch dowel or a half-inch bolt, and the more aligned it is with these two holes, more solid the engine is. That is where detonation occurs. That is where power is made. That's where torque's made. That's where the engine wants to separate apart. So this is essentially holding it in. That's all you need to do to your engine. Oh yeah. Thanks to Keeps, I have something to have blowing off in the wind is my hair. I am over 40 years old. I am 40 years old, but I'm past my birthday. I have made it this far in life with this much hair. This stuff works. This is solving a problem I have had for many years. And in fact, I was a customer of theirs before they reached out to me because I reached out to them. I wanted to show what Keeps can do. And Keeps is focused on preventing hair loss. Growing back hair that you did lose, but preventing it in the first place. And you know when it's starting to go. It's very clear. Hair gets thin, you get the crown and the corners here. 2 out of every 3 men end up experiencing some form of it by the age of 35. I must have been 35 when I was 28 because it just wasn't being kind to me. I don't know how much less I would have. I focused on preventing hair loss. Not only did it stop the loss and the thinning, it regrew in the corners here. And I have thicker hair than I did when I was 35. Go to the website, all the questions, all the uncertainty, all answered right there. And right now, if you go to keeps.com/RobDahm, you sign up and get a special offer. That's keeps.com/RobDahm. The engine isn't the reason that rotaries are unreliable. It's the supporting mods around the engine. So that's what you're gonna spend most of your money on. You cheap out on these next couple sections, you are on your own, and I hate you because you're going to be the person that's going to say, rotary engines suck, my engine blew up, my tuner this. No. Don't compromise. One of the most important things to this is fuel injectors. We have 1,700 primaries, ID 1,700Xs, and then for the secondaries, we have 2,600X. We have a lot of fuel in 4 injectors. When we made 700 horsepower in this car, we did it on pump E85. What you're gonna need is some sort of additive to lubricate the apex seal. That's going to be your premix. If somebody tells you to put 2 ounces of premix for every gallon, they're just making you waste your money. It's gonna make your car smoke like crazy. I did it for a while and went down to 1.5 and even sometimes 1.2 ounces per gallon. I don't see any more wear. When it comes to the type of premix that you want, it has to be alcohol soluble. Ethanol and methanol are both alcohols. I use Super Technoplate on the 4-rotor. I've actually been testing the renewable lubricants product on both my 2 rotors, and I'm very impressed. We're running a Fuel Labs single brushless pump in a tank in the back. It's what you've seen this entire time. That has not changed. A lot of people will commonly go to the Hellcat pump, which is a Walbro 525 liter per hour. This is 600 liter per hour. You're thinking they're basically the same pump. One's way cheaper. That is actually very far from the truth. Brushless takes about almost exactly half the current. Okay, cool, Rob, you saved current, but the alternator is gonna work either way. No. I guarantee you have the least qualifiable gauge of wiring to your fuel pump. I guarantee it's undersized for what you think you need. No, it won't burn out, but when a wire is too thin, the voltage drops from the front of the wire to the back of the wire. You can literally take a voltmeter and you'll see a voltage drop. Why does that matter so much? Because the 525 Walbro drops dramatically in performance the lower voltage it gets. Pumps love high voltage. The 23 amps it takes for the Walbro to run and make 700 horsepower for a rotary, you need minimum 10 gauge wire running that entire length. Probably the star of the show for me is the Garrett G40-900. It has a 62 millimeter diameter, so it's smaller, and then a much larger outlet. That ratio on that turbo is ideal for rotary engines. The turbo overall is slightly too large for my personal taste, but that's exactly how to make 700 horsepower as wide and long as you want. We took it all the way to its limits, where it's just like, I can't do anymore. There was no one particular restriction. The turbo was just giving all it had. We have bent the intake and the outlet of the intercooler. We've ovaled them to keep as much radiator as possible. It's got a decent front mount intercooler core from Garrett. We were measuring everything: pressure, temperature going into the intercooler, pressure and temperature coming out, exhaust back pressure each rotor. We have oxygen sensors on each rotor. We have exhaust gas temperature sensors in each rotor. We have 3 O2 sensors on this thing. Everything is being monitored because my dear friend Elliot from TurboSource says, I need you to validate my intake manifold. He came out and helped me get this all together. That was in the previous video. Things that I talk about on my channel are something I use or have tested. And so I took that very seriously. He's not here. This is fully independent. I'm not paid. I don't want the intake manifold. The stock manifold works great. The data you see is as brutally accurate and repeatable. We have IGN-1A coils. We're running 9 and 10 spark plugs. Those 10s on the trailings were just at their limit. On the last pull, you could see the RPM shaking, which often means we're at the limit of the ignition system. But IGN-1As can ignite this much fuel per rotor, 350 horsepower per rotor, to the wheels. One of the reasons that all of these cars run so well is my DC power alternator keeps me at a solid 14.6 volts, to the point where my Haltech R3 sends the signal directly to the alternator. When you're logging on your computer 14.6 volts, if you don't see that, I know something is pulling way too much current. Now that you know what is on this car, follow me on the little adventure as we take it up and up into the more power and just see how the car handles it. I'm gonna go ahead and do a 15 PSI pull. We can test the other manifold kind of quickly at a lower boost level instead of just putting a new manifold on and just doing a full power pull. So I'm curious what 15 PSI is on this car now. So that's a nice solid 466. First successful run with Elliott's manifold. I set that to 10 PSI and that's roughly what we got, low 400s. So we're gonna go ahead and do our very first apples to apples comparison at 15 PSI. It's just blowing air right around my throttle body and going right out the engine bay. The O-ring that was made was way too loose, and so we couldn't use it again. We have to fix our intake O-ring. I'm gonna leave you guys with this. I could smell it on the pulls. This means we gotta come back. When I'm at the dyno several days in a row, I am learning something very actively, and that is the case with this car. We have made the peak number, we made it early on, but that's not what I use a dyno for. And in this case, there's a lot of testing, especially with Turbulent's manifold, where the peaks and valleys are. Now, one of the things we had an issue with earlier is we did a pull, trying to go back to back at what 15 PSI is. Our intake gasket let out, causing the car to drop and boost. Now with that intake gasket fixed, we are gonna do the 15 PSI pull and compare it to the 466 horsepower that the stock intake got and see what the story tells us. In that run, we actually lost 40 horsepower because the air was just outside of the blow-off valve. The blow-off valve could only hold so much boost pressure back. Yeah, we're gonna have to do the pull again. At the top of the blow-off valve, I think it's bleeding boost. Setting off car alarms here tonight with our slowest car. What did that do? 489. We lost 40 some horsepower just because of the blow-off valve not being plugged in. It's got its spring to fight that, but it was opening up and bleeding boost. This is the most equal runs ever, I think, in the history of rotary dynos. All the other metrics are the same. Turbo spooled up and did the exact same thing. The wastegate did almost identical things. And so this is really a battle of the intake. A little bit of horsepower is lost in the mid-range. This is a little bit exaggerated because the stock manifold ones started going a little rich right at 8,000. So this drop-off is a little bit more aggressive. Clearly, where this manifold wants to live on a stock car is above 7,000 RPM. This is about as back-to-back as you can get. I'm gonna go ahead and step it up to 20 pounds of boost. We didn't dyno the other one at 20 pounds of boost, but I wanna work my way up to 25. That tells you a lot. Those boost settings worked on the stock manifold. They created a nice clean kind of up and then over. This one overshot boost big time. There's way less restriction in the intake manifold. This one shot all the way up to 27 PSI. It was definitely too much fuel when it spiked up here, so it's less efficient down here. It saved itself, but it started to go lean right at 9,000. So it was making really good power at the very top end, but that's also showing you that there's way more air making it into this car at the top end. I'm gonna go ahead and set it up to 25 and then see what we get there. spiking early, apples to the stock manifold, not really letting it even adjust. It's a little bit safer, it's a little bit smoother, but making a shit ton of power in mid-range. It is running the slightest bit leaner than the other manifold was, so I added some fuel in, which means that there's more air. Something that I'm noticing right now is at 8,000 RPM, it's flowing more. 5 PSI less restriction on the intake manifold. I do suspect that we'll see higher top end. Everything's looking really, really good. We're gonna go to 30 and get the most apples to apples comparison at the absolute edge of this G4900 and see what it tells us, because that's gonna tell us a lot about turbo efficiency at the limit.
What do you think it's gonna make?
I think 721.
I said 22 off camera. What do you guys say?
I'm gonna stand by my 715.
708.
DK called it. Amazing results. Now, from first glance, it picked up 20 horsepower on the very top end. But there is so much information. Most of the people that are doing these sort of back-to-back things, they're not constraining the car. They're letting it eat more, so it's making more power. Does this manifold make the turbo more efficient at its limit? And the answer is a resounding yes. We're really at the limit of the turbo. The turbo is now generating more heat. It actually dropped to 27, 26 PSI at the top and made more power. It's giving all it can give. The wastegate was shutting more and more and more. That was the absolute limit of the turbo. It really started to diverge and make more power at about 6,000 RPM. Facts are right there. That tells you everything about this. And we are maxed out. I've never pushed a car this hard per rotor, because this is equivalent to the 4-rotor at 1,400 horsepower. But here I am doing back-to-back pulls 3 nights in a row, different manifolds, just to get us the best data. If you are trying to make as much power on your 2-rotor as possible, this is the piece to get. Down low, under 2,000 RPM on stock street ports, it's a little rough. It doesn't have the runner length that is needed to get those really small exhaust pulses going. And it's not divided, it's wide open. So you don't have primaries activating and then secondaries, you have everything. So if you are looking to make a lot of power, and quite frankly, more than me, it's a no-brainer. That upper intake manifold, actually, just that. You would think that like I put a bigger turbo on it, you would think that I cut the exhaust off, but it's just the upper intake manifold. You've lost your mind and you've made it this far. This is all about the tuning section. This is where the cheese is made. My tried and true, I've been in bled with the Nexus series. It's incredible. You can use a lot of other ECUs, but they don't have many of these functions. The way they organize this main menu is just exactly how you need to think. If you don't have these 3 areas figured out, don't even waste your time with the rest of this. The trigger system. Rotaries are so damn sensitive to trigger wheels. I recommend you using a very clean, solid trigger wheel. The amount of information that matters with a rotary engine is nuts when it comes to timing. Turn all your fuel systems off, spin the engine with a starter, and they have a built-in scope. It will show you your trigger wheel firing off. Make sure it's the right order, make sure it's the right dead tooth, make sure your timing is correct. Do not assume anything. Especially like, hey, the shop checked all this. Every time somebody said, hey, we've checked the trigger wheel, we've checked the ignition system, do you know why it's stumbling here? It's the trigger wheel and the ignition system every single time. Do not get an ego. Act like a computer when you are tuning. Facts. No printer, just facts. 99 times out of 100, it ends up being somebody overlooked something. Next system, fuel system on here is incredible. This kind of comes from the Attribution era. I've got stages of injectors. The thing with making power is that you have to have bigger things to make the top number, so you have a problem at the low end. Bigger injectors often cause you problems. That's where Haltech really shines. We're gonna go to the fuel system tuning, and you're gonna see these things called dead times, which all ECUs do. This is how much time it takes at these pressure levels with this voltage for the injector to respond. But then here's where you start getting into really cool things, is that injector pressure differential. The more pressure that the injector sees, the more it can flow. ID Injector puts this in a really obscure place. There's like a sub menu, you go to another page, and then you have to download the Excel spreadsheet. Worth doing. The idea is that the Haltech can actually plan ahead and say, oh, you know what, this much boost, this much this, the injector's either got too much pressure or not enough, and it will adjust the flow. A good example is like on the 4-rotor, we were racing Ken Block, my fuel system found its limit and it started dropping in fuel pressure. Well, a normal car would have gone lean and blown. But the Haltech said, hey, I know my pressure's dropping. I can't flow as much. Double the amount of time that the injector's on. The last major fuel system thing. This is a secret sauce for me. This is not on by default. It's got a weird ass name that means nothing to anybody other than super obscure people. This is where you can make or break your car. Short pulse width adder. The idea is that if you are injecting only a quarter of a millisecond of fuel, so real, or half a millisecond of fuel, or 1 millisecond of fuel, up to 2 and 3, that's not that short anymore. It's not linear. It's not a quarter of a millisecond, half a millisecond. There's a percentage more and a percentage less. It's up and down. This is all characterized by ID. They know that, hey, at small amounts of these bigger injectors, they're not linear. You can't just assume that. And so you can idle a car off of much bigger injectors because this data is known. If you have a quarter of a millisecond, you have to add another quarter of a millisecond. So they're on for half a millisecond. That's essentially what that's saying. So here, if you're going to add half a millisecond of fuel, you end up adding 0.7 milliseconds of fuel. But 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, 0.7. So if you're thinking in your mind, hey, I'm going to add a really small amount up to double that, it's all the same in the end result. They all even out. So that injector can't inject less than 0.5 milliseconds of fuel. Why do I say that? Because this next section is going to show you how to use this information. Injector staging is one of the most weird, understood, misunderstood things, underutilized things in the world of tuning. This is only relevant to how your intake manifold works. This one map I have right here shows you on a stock intake manifold with the butterfly valves working. When the engine is at idle, there is a vacuum. That little canister on the side of the intake manifold closes the secondary runners, meaning that all your air is going through the 2 primary ports. If you have injectors putting fuel in all 4 ports, well, there's no air for the outer 2, and they just hit the walls and dribble and eventually go into your engine as solid fuel. The benefit is that low end idle of just the primary runners getting all the air. You have these bigger injectors shooting tons of fuel. You have a better chance of that not collecting on the walls. It still does, but more of it's suspended in air, more atomized, and so you gain so much torque just by having that all thought out. So you can see here, in vacuum, do not run these second injectors. 0, do not, don't fuck with them. Even at 0 PSI, don't fuck with them. But anything above that, where we are in positive manifold pressure, meaning boost, at lower RPM, I have the secondary injectors starting to come on, and then above 3,000, they are 66% of the flow. Why 66%? If you take 1,700, 2,600, they're the same size bigger as the ratio of the injectors. So 2/3 of the flow is the bigger injectors. Every bit of air gets the same amount of fuel in it. That's your goal at top level performance. You want all the air going into the motor to have all the fuel evenly dispersed in it. You can run this where the secondaries don't ever turn on. And now you have half the air with tons of fuel, half the air with no fuel. You're talking about swirling, weird, inconsistent air to fuel ratio mixtures. That is not good for the motor. It will work, but that is not good. Your goal is to get all of the air filled with all of the fuel. This is a result. This is called the volumetric efficiency, the VE map for the engine. So it's trying to estimate, and it does a pretty damn good job at it, of saying that the engine is this much efficient at this horsepower and RPM. This very much shows you what my engine currently is that yes, you can say, oh, the red area is bad. It's not bad. It's just that the engine is less efficient at idle. Doesn't mean much more than that. If you had a really small turbo, this would be closer to 100, and then these would be 50s. Seeing over 100% is also kind of relative, but it does tell you that, hey, the engine's really efficiently getting the ideal amount of air in and out of the motor. That's a result. All I'm doing is adjusting this to get my target. To get this page where you want it, let's talk about your target. If you want to look for my secrets to tuning and get rid of all the bullshit, fake tuners and all that other shit in there, this is what you see me tune my engines to. This is aggressive because I can work on my own engines. This is lambda. So this is the air to fuel ratio that I am looking for at these RPMs and horsepower levels. This is meant for bursts of power. When you're on the dyno and when you're on the street, the engine's cold, relatively speaking, because you're just cruising, exhaust temperatures are low, everything's fine. When you stomp on that pedal, everything heats up. Now, if you're gonna do a 1/4 mile run, your engine is sustaining heat for that 1/4 mile. half-mile run, you're sustaining even hotter heat longer. That's why you don't see as many people survive the half-mile, and you see all these people actually making more power in the quarter-mile. If you carried that out to half-mile, most of those engines would blow. They're as aggressive as possible for that distance. You're on the street, engine's much colder, you're not able to hook up as hard, so you can show off more power for that burst of 1 to 2 gear pulls. If you're going to do endurance racing, you knock this down a little bit. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I run the 3-rotor at this level, and it doesn't blow up. But again, I have over the top amount of energy and effort spent into monitoring the motor. If you were going to go run this and not have as many sensors, I would maybe say your target is like 0.78. The engine will start to break up at 0.71. If you're wondering, peak power is made at 0.87. That is like just a basic fact of air to fuel ratio. 0.87 is the ideal number. These are my numbers right here. This car will last quite a while at these numbers, beating the shit out of it. But I have O2 sensors on each runner. I have EGT sensors. I'm very particular. And if it blows, I rebuild it. If you go too rich, you actually end up fucking yourself over. So don't listen to like, oh, be super careful and safe. That doesn't help you in this case. It only helps you if you're going to be doing like endurance stuff, because you're using the fuel not as a safety. You're using the fuel to cool the combustion chamber. Other major area that I'm going to leave you guys with, the one that I get asked the most about, is what are my ignition timing numbers? This is 0 PSI all up to 9,000 RPM, and then here's boost. This is my base table. And because I have my timing so solidly set, I know without a shadow of a doubt that when it's at 17 degrees of timing, it's actually at 17 degrees of timing. It's not floating, it's not shifting. I'm very particular about that. The area I want to talk about mostly is the middle area. If you set all of this middle area to like 5 degrees, so very safe and conservative timing, you almost make the exact same amount of power. Why don't I have that here? Because I didn't have time to adjust it. The bigger this number is, the more the engine is firing the spark plugs off before the engine is at its peak. So it's 17 degrees before the engine is like there. So you're basically trying to guess the peak combustion. And the reason why you can go that early is because the flame doesn't explode, it travels along the pocket, flame front and all that shit. So what you're trying to do is time it so the flame front is right at the pinnacle of mass expansion right as it passes top dead center. You're just trying to make the most amount of power, right? Well, the problem is 22 degrees of timing is very aggressive, and what will happen is your trailing plugs will cause a lot of problems. Right here is the engine at top dead center. That is the peak compression, and hopefully after that you're about to make some party juice with all the horsepower and torque right there. So this is considered 0 degrees. The E shaft is centered here and it's pointing this way. That's 0 degrees. Do a full cycle backwards, that's 360 degrees. So it's just on a different rotor face. When you're talking about 0 or 360 degrees, 720, they all look like this. It's just different faces of the rotor. Don't worry so much about how rotor engines work as much as worry about the angle that I'm talking about and what that means right here. And this is at the moment where your air is about to get crushed and compressed into here. There's no port. This is closed off. Whatever fuel you've put into the motor here is just on the way to the crush factory. When you look at it like this, you can see the exact opposite. There's a vacuum being pulled on this port, and away you go. What degree is this at? Well, this is about 460 degrees. The exhaust is here, the intake's about to open. You're about 460 degrees before your party time. Once you start opening about 440 degrees or so, you start pulling that vacuum, and then at about 360 degrees or so, which is right here, you're about at the peak of vacuum. You're about to just kind of finish that close off, and so then at some point ultimately begins compression. Injector timing. It doesn't matter beginning or end, you can do it two different ways. All you care about is fuel is going into here, staying in the air, and the air is being sucked into the motor or pushed, but at the ideal moment. So you want fuel going in at that 400-ish degrees before top dead center. If you do it too soon, say 480 degrees, 500 degrees, well, the exhaust is open and it can actually travel along this thin wall through this pocket, and you will have fuel just sucked out because the exhaust pulses. That vacuum will pull fuel straight out your motor. That fuel will then ignite out here, go to your oxygen sensor and say, yes, all the fuel was burned, and your engine will detonate. You close off the exhaust port, 440 degrees before this, start shooting fuel in here. It starts opening up, sucking in the fuel, sucking in the air, being pushed in either way, And then you want to try and stop the injection like 180 degrees before you compress it. You want to make sure that your injectors are occurring 440 degrees before the party and ending 180 degrees before the party. That is not 360 degrees. So why I tell you this is that 440 minus 180 ends up being almost like 270 degrees. You want to make sure your fuel injectors are large enough that you're only using 75% of your injector, because otherwise if they're spraying the whole time, 15% of your fuel, especially on highly ported motors, is just going right out the exhaust. I've seen it happen myself. It's so misunderstood. Your engine reads fine, your plugs are bright white, and you start blowing your motor because the fuel is just passing by. 440 to 180 is your magic numbers in there. People can argue in the comments between, start of injection, engine injection, but that's your sweet spot in there, and you want to keep your injectors in that range for each combustion event. Just like piston engine, rotaries have different compression ratios. A high compression rotary requires less timing. So if you're gonna say, hey, Rob, you run 17 degrees of timing on an FD rotor, well, I'm not running on an FD rotor. I'm running 17 degrees of timing on a lower compression FC engine. And so it's Series 4, which is lower compression than this. So technically, if you go and run these numbers on your FD, you are running way more aggressively than I am. That's something that you have to take into account. I don't know the magic numbers. Correct answer to your personal ignition map is to go on a low dyno. Set all this to 10, set it all to 15, and then you'll notice that certain areas don't make a difference. So why make it so aggressive? Let that heat go out into the turbo and help spool the turbo. It's a tomato kind of thing there. You're not changing performance, and you can kind of get the heat to stay out of the motor instead of holding inside of it. That's the correct answer on timing, is you really need to look at the dyno, and especially a low dyno will tell you the most information about that. There are a billion other details that we could talk about. We could talk about the closed loop control of few tuning. We could talk about the closed loop control of boost tuning. Those are very detailed things that could do their own videos on. The point is that this is the overall summary on what I did to make 700 horsepower. Now, any questions you have, throw them in the comments. I'm sure I'm missing a billion other things because there's so many pieces involved, but this is my attempt of showing you what I will defend as a solid way to make 700 horsepower that you absolutely do not need on a two-rotor.